All right, so to continue our discussion about Egyptian religion, we're going to focus a little bit now on the process of mummification. Now, there are many, many videos out there that teach about the process, and you are going to have this presentation available to you so that you can come back and watch these videos that have been embedded. I'm not going to take the time right now to show them to you. You'll be able to come back and work with them. All right, so let's just talk about the steps of mummification. So the idea of rebirth is the reason that they are mummifying people. And when we say that, you have to understand that it wasn't just pharaohs that were mummified. Everyone of any importance, and even anyone who had lived a good life. We talked about the fact that criminals perhaps didn't get mummified because they weren't expected to have an afterlife as a punishment. They were buried without any possibility of survival in the next life. But most people were, to some degree, preserved. And this would have happened accidentally, guys. Originally, the burial practices of the ancient Egyptians, this was really, really new and really a very early practice. The people of Mesopotamia would have been the very first people to ever bury someone in a ritualistic fashion. They were the first people that came up with any type of formalized religion. Neolithic people and probably even Paleolithic people would have done something to, put the body at rest, but maybe not with formal rituals. All right. But the idea of burying originally would have been just like we do today, put them in the ground. Underneath, in this case, it would have been sand because that's where they were. They would have buried their dead in the sand, and probably with some pottery or with some other things because the belief in an afterlife was there. But probably what happened was a storm came up, or they had wind, and bodies got uncovered. And they understood, or they realized that the dryness of the sand had preserved the body in some fashion. So they learned that when you dry a body out, it lasts longer. So that knowledge that happened probably by accident led them to this process of preserving their bodies in an intentional way so that they weren't dried out, so that they would last longer. So the process of mummification started, I'm sure, by accident, and then over time developed into the steps that they took towards the end of the Egyptian reign of importance in the world. So the very first thing that happened when a person died is they tried to make sure they were dead. They tried to wake them up. I want you to imagine, folks, that they didn't have all of the tests and things like that to know that a heart was still beating or that someone was still breathing that we have today. Even in the Middle Ages, thousands of years after ancient Egypt, people were accidentally buried alive because they appeared dead. Their heart had slowed down so much that you couldn't hear the heartbeat anymore. So the first thing that the priests did was to recite some prayers, and they just were making sure they weren't going to make a big mistake, because the very first thing they did after they washed the body and they purified it was they're going to cut into it. So they wanted to remove the organs. If you think about drying something out, you're going to need to do it not just from the outside, but from the inside as well. And so they're going to remove some of the organs in the abdomen area, so that part of the body is pretty empty, so that they can dry the body from the inside as well as the outside. What an interesting fact was, it was illegal to cut into a body, alive or dead. And so even though they knew they needed to, they put on kind of a play of sorts, a ritual, I'm going to call it, where the priest that was going to make the incision came in with the mask of Anubis, and he made the incision into the body, and then the other priests in the room chased him out of the room, um, as kind of a punishment. Get out of here, you can't do that. Obviously it was all an act because they needed the incision, but they were going through the motions of punishing the person who had done this illegal thing by cutting into the body. Okay, so once they did that, they made a tiny little incision. They didn't cut the body completely open. They just made a little tiny incision in the side, and they were removing some of the major organs in the interior of the body. They took out the liver, the intestines, the lungs, and the stomach. And they knew that this person in their afterlife was going to need those organs, so they preserved them as well. So they put them in something called canopic jars, and they preserved the organs in these different canopic jars, and then the jars were buried in the tomb with the body. And each jar, as it says here, had a different head on it, and each one held a specific organ. Now, canopic jars later on in Egyptian history weren't used anymore, so this was kind of an early practice. Now, because they need to dry every part of the body out, they're going to stuff that cavity now, the part of the body that they've emptied, they're going to put something in there that's going to help dry it. And one of the most drying substances, I guess you'd call it, on the planet is salt. I want you to think about when you put salt on your tongue, your mouth immediately starts to water. Okay, think about that for a second. What's actually happening is the salt is pulling moisture out of your tongue. It's if you let it sit there long enough, it'd start to dry your tongue out, kind of like beef jerky. Gross, right? I know. So Egypt had this natural salt called natron. And this salt they would mine out of the ground, and you can see a video in a little bit that'll show you mining natron. And they use that to dry out the bodies. So they're going to take some natron and they're going to stuff it inside the person in an attempt to help dry out the inside of the body. All right. Now, so they pretty much have emptied, the parts of the body that have things that could be removed. They left the heart in because they really thought the heart was the most important part of the person. It was where their soul originally lived, and it was the thinking part of the person. They didn't know the brain had much to do with how we behave and how we act and how we think and how we talk. So most mummies actually had the heart left in. If they did remove the heart, which some mummies have been found with the heart removed, they would replace it with a stone that had been beautifully carved to look like a beetle. A big beetle that was very prevalent in Egypt, and we call them dung beetles, because of how they behave on Earth. So these beetles were they lay their eggs in dung, which is poo. Animal poo out in the desert. I know, gross. But that was a safe place that they would lay their eggs, because no animal is going to come and dig through stinky poo to eat their eggs. So it protected them. And the mother beetle would push the dung. They could be seen rolling the dung across the desert, carrying their eggs with them, as they, went about their life. And so the Egyptians witnessed this. And they also witnessed, from this pile of poo, all these insects emerging, the new beetles being born. And so to them, this beetle was able to bring life from death, because they considered dung to be kind of like part of you that had died, so to speak, So these special beetles were very, very honored in Egyptian culture because they brought life from death. So they would carve these stones to look like this beetle, and sometimes those were placed in place of the heart. Okay. The brain, like I told you earlier, was not valued at all, but they knew that they needed to get it out of the skull because it's another place that could rot. And so they needed to empty the skull cavity. So this is I hope you're not watching this before lunch, folks. So they would take a long hook and they would shove that. First they would take like a chisel and a hammer, and they would stick the chisel in the person's nose, and they would hammer it so that it could break the little membrane that's at the back of your nose that separates your face from your skull. So it's not really a bone. If you've ever seen a skeleton, you know there's a triangle where your nose usually is because your nose is cartilage. It's not bone, but it's still pretty hard. So you need to break through that. So they would take a chisel and they would hammer through the back of the nose to get to the skull. Then they would take this hook and they would stick it up in there and they would swirl the hook around really, really fast to try to scramble the brains. Now, when you guys see pictures of the brain, like sitting in a jar or whatever in a science video, that brain has been preserved. It had things put in it to solidify it, but your brain is kind of the consistency of Jello. So it's much more viscous than solid. And so if you scramble it enough, it's going to turn into liquid. Think about stirring Jello really, really fast. And so they would do that, and then they would tip the body and pour out the brains, so that the cavity of the skull was empty. And then they would do the incision to cut the organs out. After the organs were, oh, I just lost where I was. Hold on. Sorry. After the organs were removed, they would cover the body in that salt called natron. And they would put the body on a slab that was tilted on an angle and then cover it with this salt. And they would come back day after day and remove the salt after it had soaked up some of the moisture of the body, and they would put new salt on. And because salt can get really crusty and hard and soak up too much moisture, and then it won't anymore. So then, so think about that room and how absolutely putrid smelling it would have to be in order to dry out these bodies. And for the most part, they say it took 40 days, but it's going to depend on the size of the person. You know, how big is this person that we have to dry out completely and make them into essentially people jerky? I know it's gross, guys, but it's the best analogy I can think of to describe what kind of texture they're trying to get the skin to have. So then after that, after the body had been completely dried out, they would remove the salt, and then they would fill parts with linen, which is a kind of cloth that we talked about in the geography video, or sawdust. And they would stuff the body, because I want you to think about, if you didn't have any stomach or intestines or any of those things, there's no bone other than your spine right there. You'd be completely flat. You know, you'd have nothing between your ribs and your hips. That would just be flat except for the spine. So they stuffed that so the person still kind of had a form to them. They would stuff resin, which is kind of like, think about hardened tree sap. Okay, like wax almost, but then it hardens. They'd put that up the nose so that the nose would still have a form, because that cartilage that makes your nose is going to disintegrate. The bones won't and the skin won't now that they've preserved it, but the cartilage will. So they're going to stuff things in the nose so that the nose can kind of keep some of its shape. And then they're stuffing the body to kind of give it some shape. All right? And it's going to help to continue to dry it out. If they're filling it with more salt. They're filling it with cloth or sawdust. If there's any moisture left, it's going to be taken away. All right, then the next thing is they start to wrap the person in linen bandages. And this, when you think about mummies, you think about them being able to walk and their arms are outstretched in those scary movies and things like that. And in a way, if you were to unwrap a mummy a little bit, then yeah, they would be able to do that because they're going to wrap every single thing separately and then together. So every toe was wrapped by itself, and then the whole foot was wrapped together, and then the leg was wrapped, and then both feet would be wrapped together, and then up the leg. Okay, every finger would be wrapped individually, and then the hand would be wrapped, and then up the arm, and then they would cross the arms over the body, and after the body had been wrapped, they would wrap it together. The reason for this is if you have think about places that you sweat, like, if your arms are next to your body on a hot day, you can sweat there. Sometimes you can feel heat between your fingers on a hot day. So they're trying to not let skin touch skin because they want any possible moisture left to be soaked up. So when those fingers were wrapped individually, it's linen touching linen, not skin touching skin. So the chances of having a little spot that starts to decay is very slim. So everything is wrapped individually and then wrapped together so that it looks like the picture down at the bottom, where it's all one human-shaped form, all wrapped very, very tightly together. As they wrap, they stick little gems, little charms in the layers of the linen because it helps to protect the person's soul as they pass on. And then they use something called a resin, which we talked about a bit ago. It's kind of like taking tree sap while it's liquid. I'm not talking, maple syrup, folks. Maple syrup has a whole lot of stuff added to it to make it taste like it does. But trees that have a resin to it, it's very, very, very sticky and it hardens almost like a stone. As a matter of fact, if you've ever seen amber, which is a stone that people make jewelry out of, that was once tree sap. All right, so it hardens to be, a very, very solid thing. So they're brushing these layers with resin to seal them all. So the bandages really aren't bandages anymore. They become these solid glue-like pieces. All right, so that's the next step. So the whole process from the time the person died until the time they're wrapped might be about 70 days, depending again on the size of the person and how much care is being taken to prepare their mummy. They're going to be placed in one coffin that's decorated to look like them, and then maybe several other coffins inside each other before they're taken to their place of burial. Then there are some rituals that are done. One of the most important rituals is the weighing of the heart, and you'll have an opportunity to watch these videos to learn a little bit more about them. But the weighing of the heart is shown here in this bottom picture. And essentially you take the person's heart, and this is all symbolic, guys, all right? So remember, we left the heart inside. So they're not actually taking that person's heart. They're kind of saying a prayer, and it's following this ritual. So they're taking the heart and they're weighing it against the feather of truth. All right, so if you think about a feather, obviously a heart would weigh more than a feather. But if this person has lived a good life, then the heart should be equal to the feather of truth. It shouldn't weigh more. And so all through the person's life, they've been taught that they're going to have this final judgment at the end of their life. And if their heart is not pure, then their heart will be devoured by this dog-looking thing that's sitting right here in the middle, the devourer, Ma'at the devourer, and their life is over. Their afterlife is done. So that idea of, oh my gosh, I have to live a good life, otherwise I'm not going to have an afterlife, was kind of a training force throughout their whole existence on Earth. is that idea of being a good person. So this ritual happened, and that said, okay, yep, nope, you're good. You lived a good life. We've judged you. Your heart is pure. It's equal to the feather of truth, so you may move on. And then they do something called the opening of the mouth ceremony. And this is where they symbolically take a, it looks like it's essentially a blade, but it looks like a stick with a hook on the end of it, and they put it up to the mouth of the mummy. Now, obviously, they've just spent all this time sealing this person. They're not going to cut the cloth at their mouth, because that would defeat all of the work that they just did. But symbolically, they open the mouth, which means this person can speak and they can eat and have use of their body in the afterlife. So these two rituals take place right before the person is buried. And then anything they could possibly need in the afterlife is buried with them. Furniture, statues, games, food, servants, or statues of servants. They paint the walls with an image such as this, with spells and prayers from the Book of the Dead. Anything that this person might need in their afterlife is geared to them. So the Book of the Dead might have 300 spells in it, but this person might only need 12 of them. And those 12 go in the tomb with this person, either on papyrus scrolls or painted on the walls of the tomb and things like that. So the process of finally burying someone of great importance, like a pharaoh or an important leader, would have taken 3 months. And all that time they're gathering all of these things to put with this person so that they can have an afterlife of comfort.